guys, in this tutorial we're going to be learning how to use complementary colors to create a vibrant composition. So complementary colors are colors that oppose one another on the color wheel. So for instance, we have purple and yellow here, and blue and orange. When we combine these, they create a fairly dull color, but when we put them side by side, they tend to enhance one another. So the orangish colors within the Flamingo here are enhanced by the blues of the background. We're also going to be using harmonious colors. These are colors that sit side by side on the color wheel. So for instance, blue sits next to purple, sits next to red-violet, sits next to red, sits next to orange. And the way we're going to have these joining together will create a harmonious scene. Before we get started, I just want to review some of the techniques that we're going to use here. We're going to be using a wax resist. So I've got a tiny bit of wax here. You can use a candle for this, and that's where we put the wax down on the paper. And then we can come over with our colors. Let me just do this here. And the area we've put the wax down on is going to be reserved. We're also going to be using the technique of reserving space. So reserving space is when you wet the area around a space that you want to preserve before putting the paint in. So here I'm putting clear water around the shape of the circle, and then I'm going to, this is called dropping in, when we just drop the paint into the surrounding area. I'm going to just drop the paint into the surrounding area, and it should avoid the circle. Now let me just see where that is. So see, the edges here are going to be preserved. Let me just do that one more time just to make it a little bit more apparent. I'll draw a triangle first. So you'll see the paint is avoiding the triangle because it's just flowing where I've put down the water. And then finally, we're going to use a technique called lifting out. So let me just do that here. That's when we put down our paint and then using a clean, fairly dry brush, we come back in and lift out some of that color. Now we have to do this while the paint is fairly wet, so this will be fairly quick. So we're going to be wetting certain areas bit by bit, so one part at a time. We won't wet our entire paper first as we move through the composition. Okay, so getting started. I'm going to use a watercolor pencil in pink, but you can use just a high H pencil if you would like, if you don't have a watercolor pencil. I'm just using this so it'll show up on the screen, and also it'll disappear when I put the water over it. I'm using the Anilinky Watercolours that we'll use in class, and I'm using two round brushes. One is a medium-sized one and one is a smaller-sized one. Round brushes are the brushes that are kind of rounded as opposed to flat on the top. And I'm going to start by drafting out the flamingo. The thing here, this entire composition is made up pretty much of ovals. So if you have a spare sheet of paper, you might want to practice just drawing a few ovals. We've also got a figure 8 here. So I'm going to create the flamingo using a figure 8 and an oval. So you'll want to practice your composition a little bit on a spare sheet of paper, but once you're happy with where you're going to put your flamingo on the paper, we can get started. So I'm going to start with just an oval for the body of the flamingo. It's kind of pointed down a little bit. And then I'm going to identify where the neck hits the body and draw a figure 8 because the beak is just tapered down. So the whole thing is going to follow a figure 8. And completing the form, even when we're not going to draw all of it, can be a useful thing to do because it creates a sense of continuity. So you don't want to, try to do perfect outlines. You want to think in terms of complete forms. If you want, you can do another kind of oval on top that moves down into a wing. And then I'm just going to use sort of stick lines for the legs. And I'm also going to think of the water as a group of ovals. These are going to be much more narrow ovals, so not very wide at the top. So I'm just going to create some concentric ovals that are going to be where the ripples in the water are going to be. And now I can start to refine this shape a little bit more. So I'm just going to come in to the neck, moving up. I'm going to form this into a beak. And you'll notice that the neck is kind of thinner as we move towards the head, and then it gets thicker as it attaches to the body. Also remember that these initial marks, they're drafting marks. So it's not like, the goal isn't to put a circle down exactly where the bird is going to be. It's to give you something on your paper that you can work with and help give you a better idea of how to place things overall. So it's okay if these initial marks aren't, perfectly placed. Their goal is just to show us the generality of where we're going to be putting our form. Okay, and this part is optional, but this particular flamingo has some water kind of falling from its beak. So I'm going to take my wax and just put in a few droplets of water. I'm going to keep this very vertical, and this is so that when I come over with the paint, these areas are going to be reserved. If you want, you can also put in a few bit of reserved spaces with the wax where the light's hitting to this side, or you can just use the lifting out technique for it. So I'm not putting down too much wax there. Now I'm going to mix up some harmonious colors for the bird. So first I'm going to wet down the area I'm going to start by working on. I'm reserving space so that I'm leaving a little clear area near the top where the feathers are going to be hitting the light. So where the light's going to be hitting, and I'm just wetting down the base of the flamingo before mixing up my colors. One of them is going to be kind of a cool red, so that's red mixed with a little bit of purple, but then diluted a bunch, and that's going to create that kind of pinky color. So there we go. So cool reds tend towards blue. So in this instance, I'm using a purple, which is a mix of blue and red to create a cool blue, since on this palette we just have a warm red, which is this one here, which tends a little bit more towards orange. Let me just get a spare sheet of paper to show you what this color looks like. So you want to dilute it quite a bit, and we'll get that nice kind of pinky color. And then I'm also going to just mix up some plain red and then some red that I've added a little bit of the orange to lighten it up. And all of these are fairly dilute. And now I'm going to work wet on wet. So I'm going to be starting by dropping in that lighter pink color. So I'm just dropping it in along the sides of the feathers where we have some lighter feathers. And you'll see that it's just moving into the space that I've reserved. So wherever I've wet the paper down, the paint is moving, but it's not moving anywhere it isn't. I'm just moving this up a little bit. And moving into the neck, the colors get a bit more red, so I'm going to mix a little bit more red. Now try to do this with one brush stroke by holding your brush upside down. That'll create a much smoother transition. So I'm holding my brush upside down and I'm trying to create the neck and just using one brush stroke. And that way we won't have all these little kind of lumps. You'll find if you work too slowly here, you'll get the paint leaving little ridges on the edges. So you might also want to just practice this step on a spare sheet of paper. So I'm just coming in with the beak. And the thing about this is you don't need to be too exact. So, you don't need to get these colors perfectly. I'm just adding some darker red towards the tail feathers here. You also really have to wait with watercolor, so you're not going to see the full color until a couple minutes in when you give it time to bleed. So you don't want to work too fast. You want to drop in little bits of color and then wait. If this color's getting too intense, you can also lift out some lighter areas by just dragging a fairly clean, dry brush across the areas that are moving into the light. And now I'm going to use some of that orangish color, so orange mixed with red, to just put in a few lighter feathers along the back. Just lifting out a few more feathers here. And dropping in some purple that I've made towards the base of the neck here while it's still wet. Going to add in a little bit of brighter orange as we move down towards the top of the legs. And then this is also going to just transition into that purple as we move down the legs. All right, so now we can move on to the water. So you can do this while the legs are still wet if you want to have their color kind of reflect in the water. If we put clear water just around the edges of the legs, whatever color we've used there is going to kind of bleed into the surroundings. And I'm just going to wet the areas that I'm going to paint one at a time. So you'll notice my water's kind of muddy at this point, which is actually not a bad thing. It's going to create more natural colors when I start to blend these in. So I'm just wetting down the full oval that I've marked out. And now I'm going to mix together some of that blue in with the purple so that we have kind of a darker blue, a warmer blue. And I'm going to drop that in concentric ovals. And then while the paint is still wet, lift out some lighter areas around this. So we move down, I'm going to add in more of the Flamingo colors, so more reds, more pinks, that pink that we've created. The colors are a little bit muddier in the reflection, so I'm mixing all of them using my dirtier palette so that we get more variation in the colors. Smooth these out. And just coming in with, along the darker areas, some more concentric circles, ovals. And you can leave it here at this point. You can have it so that the composition's just kind of moving off the page, especially if you kind of wet down the paper and just put in a few more marks here and here. But if you want to add more, we can continue by wetting down the page, moving upwards. So if I wet down the page here, you'll notice it's reserving the space that I've set apart with a wax resist. I'm just wetting the paper first using my kind of now dirty water. I'm being very careful to avoid the sides of the flamingo because I don't want the color up here to bleed into the surroundings in the background. I'm just going to, so I don't have any clean water with me right now and I can't jump up to get it, but I'm just going to apply clearer water as I move towards the edges so that we have kind of a vignette effect where, or reverse vignette where it's lighter around the edges. And as the paint dries, we can do, progressively darker ripples. So you might want to just stop here at, again at any point. But if you want to add in just a little bit more contrast, you can. I'm just making it a little bit darker around the edges of the reflection here. And now using my small round brush, I'm going to just get a bit of black and carefully, you might want to use the hairdryer to make sure your paper is dry. You can also use a pen for this. I'm going to come in and get the black on the beak. And maybe a little dot for the eye. Okay, and we'll leave it there. So you could always, keep moving along, but I'm gonna say let's leave this here. And your flamingo using complementary colors is complete.